Okay, good evening, everyone, and we're pleased to welcome you to the 14th Annual Stephen H. Schneider Memorial Lecture. This lecture is organized by Students for Sustainable Stanford and sponsored by the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. We're your hosts for tonight. My name is Kim Nguyen.
And I'm Valeria Sevis. Before we begin, please silence your cell phones. This lecture is held in honor of Dr. Stephen H. Schneider, who is a leading expert in climate science and a crucial voice in communicating research to the public. Dr. Schneider was and continues to be a hugely influential figure for the field of climate research, climate policy, and outreach. As a leading voice in the fight against climate change, Dr. Schneider served as a consultant for each president, from President Nixon to Barack Obama. As a beloved professor, Dr. Schneider has also left an indelible mark here at Stanford University. It is undeniable that he dedicated his life to us students and to the world around him.
We are here tonight thanks to Professor Terry Root. On top of a long list of scientific awards and honors, Dr. Root has dedicated her life to improving the accessibility of scientific information. Unfortunately, she could not make it tonight, but we are deeply grateful to Dr. Root for the generous guidance and support that she's put into this event. We'd also like to shout out the Woods Institute for their assistance in coordinating this event. And now we will begin our program and with a video honoring Dr. Schneider's life and work.
The climate is caused by an interaction among the energy stored in oceans and glaciers, these big masses of ice up at the poles, and that which comes in from the sun. That's where pollution comes along, because it's not just something that makes your eyes hurt and maybe shortens your life, but it can actually interfere with the energy that comes from the sun and that which goes back out.
We started out saying sort of, Houston, there's a problem in 1990. Then we said, not only is there a problem, but the humans are part of it in 1995. In 2000, Terry Root added, and plants and animals are in it too. And now we said, not only is there a problem, but it hurts the poor more than the rich. It hurts the vulnerable in Hurricane Alley and in high mountains and in the Arctic and in Mediterranean climates like California more than others.
The absolute best we're going to get away with is about 2 degrees above pre-industrial, which the EU defined as dangerous climate change, because that increases the severity of drought, flood extremes, heat waves, intensified storms, fires, and species extinction. So it's absolutely urgent that we don't go much above 2 or 3, which scares me a lot. And on our current path, we are going to be lucky to hold it to 3.
The media is trained primarily in political reporting.
Here's my thing with it. There's always been extreme weather.
That's where the hoax is, and that's where it harkens to medieval witchcraft.
This is all predicated on getting rid of capitalism, isn't it?
Where would those kids be if we did not have the fossil fuel era?
But science is not bipolar. It's not end of the world and good for you. Science is not dichotomous in 2 separate groups.
Stephen has been just an incredible wealth of inspiration and information for those of us at Stanford who are working at the interface of environment and energy and natural resources.
I mean, a student group came in this office about 2 years ago and said, we're going to go in and demand of the president that Stanford set up the following sustainability agenda. And I said, whoa, hold on. I think you should tell him that you want Stanford to do that, but why don't you first go in and tell the president what you yourselves have done, and then ask, how is Stanford as an institution going to match you? And they did that. It was very effective. President got a sustainability group energized. So you got to show that it's not your fault, but that we're part of it, and we're doing our bit. We can't do it all. We need you.
It's that little ball of water spread thinly over the earth that makes our civilization, everything we care about, possible. No ocean, no life. No ocean, certainly no us. those cycles of hydrology, those cycles of carbon, those cycles of nitrogen, need intelligence and care, and they need responsibility.
Photosynthesis is like the OG of carbon sequestration, right? And wetlands can absorb, 5 times more carbon in their soils than a tropical rainforest.
I like to note that the biological diversity of the world is an immense genetic library, which we are burning down before we've even cataloged the books, never mind reading them.
So what I'd like to do is take you guys through a little bit of history of growing power, of how we built our food system that can help heal communities.
What's possible one day is certainly not bounding me for tomorrow. And if I feel bounded by what's required, I'm missing real opportunities for economic growth, for sustainability, and for environmental protection as well.
We're not talking about incremental change or going after low-hanging fruit. We're talking about the hard stuff. We're talking about transformative change.
The accumulation of global warming pollution from human activities now in the planet's atmosphere traps as much extra heat every 24 hours as would be released, the scientists tell us, by 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs going off every day on Earth.
He had the language, he said, pay attention to the language. Climate change, sustainability, hypoxia, dead zones, turning up the thermostat, melting out polar caps. And so what happened over 16 years, the language got louder and louder, just as he predicted.
Scientists should speak up for their science because it's an obligation, in my opinion, that every person should leave the world better than they found it. And if you're a scientist who has some special knowledge about a piece of the world, and you think that knowledge needs to be joined together with that of other people to help us either take advantage of an opportunity or prevent a really bad problem, then not to say that means you're really shirking your obligation to take the opportunity of your luck at really having an understanding. You've got to do it. And you realize there'll be some people who are going to oppose you for doing it, especially those who might be losers if we have to change the way we do things and we have to get out of the status quo. And you have to be prepared to take that because that's exactly what happens. You never make change easily. The old cliche is you can't make the omelet until you crack the eggs.
Climate scientists like Dr. Schneider have given us a huge wealth of knowledge and tools to equip us against climate change. The climate change perspective now focuses on science alongside human system impacts. Dr. Schneider experience warned us of science as a contact sport, highlighting the human barriers of reaching scientific consensus in climate policy.
With this, it is our pleasure to introduce you to our 14th annual Stephen Schneider Memorial Lecture, Dr. Naomi Oreskes. Naomi Oreskes is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of the History of Science and Affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. She is an internationally renowned earth scientist, historian, and author of both scholarly and popular books and articles on the history of earth and environmental science, including most recently Why Trust Science and Science on a Mission, How Military Funding Shaped What We Do and Don't Know About the Ocean, which was awarded the Patrick Stubbs Prize in the History of Science by the American Philosophical Society. Her opinion pieces have been published in leading media outlets around the globe, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Times, and the Frankfurter Allgemeine. In 2015, she wrote the introduction to the Melville House edition of the Papal Encyclical on Climate Change and Inequality, Laudato Si.
Professor Oreskes is a leading voice on the reality of anthropogenic climate change and the history of efforts to undermine climate action. Her 2004 essay, The Scientific Consensus on Climate Change, has been widely cited, included in the Royal Society's publication, A Guide to Facts and Fictions About Climate Change, and in the Academy Award-winning film, An Inconvenient Truth. Her 2010 book with Eric N. Conway, Merchants of Doubt, has been translated into 9 languages and has sold over 100,000 copies and made into a documentary film. She is an elected fellow of the Geological Society of America, the American Geophysical Union, the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. In 2018, she became a Guggenheim Fellow, and in 2019 was awarded the British Academy Medal for her commitment to documenting the role of corporations in distorting scientific findings for political ends. In 2024, she was awarded the Non-Uno Foundation Maestro de Nuestro Tiempo Award, and in 2024, the Volvo Environmental Prize for her contributions in shaping our understanding of how scientific knowledge is collectively constructed and addressing the challenges of misinformation in public discourse. Her latest book with Eric Conway, The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market, has sold many copies and has even been translated into French and Italian.
And now that we've gotten the chance to introduce Dr. Oreskes, let's hear directly from her now.
Thank you for that very fulsome introduction. When I hear about all the things I've done, it's book in chapter. It's a giant honor to be here tonight in this lecture of commemoration to Schneider, who was a great person, a great scientist, kind of a larger than life person that you probably got from that. And I especially appreciated, I only got to know Steve a few years before he died, so I felt like on the one hand it's kind of unfair that he died so young, but on the other hand I'm really grateful. He spoke in that video about having to speak up for science, having to stand up for science. And I know that Steve cared a lot about scientific integrity, and that's really what our talk is about tonight. And so, spoiler alert, I am not going to talk about climate change, but I'm going to talk about some work that I started doing recently, kind of by accident, but has led into this very interesting area, thinking about what we collectively as a community need to do to protect scientific integrity, both in the realm of climate change and all the different aspects of sustainability. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk lately about the rise of trust in science, and some of that talk, it seems to me, is rather weak. The available evidence suggests that we don't actually face a general crisis of trust in science. And I'm going to apologize for this slide, but it comes from our Trust in Science study published last year. Nearly 200 collaborators finished the study of trust in science in 80 countries. So we were really trying to get outside the United States and understand broadly what the landscape looks like. And what we found was that in most countries, most people trust science most of the time. Here in the United States, trust in science did fall during and after the pandemic, but it's still high overall. Over the past decade, about 70 to 80% of Americans say they have a fair amount or a great deal of trust in science. And they trust science a lot more than they trust the government or media. In fact, 70 to 80% is a pretty high level of agreement compared to most things that people get polled about. But one problem with this story here, these course data, actually, by the way, I should go back and say, this is a terrible figure, I know, but it looks like no way to get into the slide. Basically, we asked people about trust in science on a scale of 1 to 5. So 1 would be you have very little trust in science, 5 would be a lot. And as you can see that in many countries, it's kind of hovering around 4, 3.5 to 4. So again, it's like a moderate amount of science in most places. But the data hide a lot of variability. And one of the key things they hide in the United States is the strong partisan divide. So if we look over here and ask about confidence in science overall, This is 2019, 2024. So it was quite high before the pandemic, 7%. It definitely took a bit of a dip during the pandemic. Looks like it's kind of recovering a bit now. But these numbers high are big problems in divide. So among people who identify as Democrats or leave Democratic, pretty high levels of trust in science, but among people who leave Republican, quite a bit lower and a big drop during the pandemic years. Moreover, these polls and most of my own work assume that we should trust science. And I think probably everyone in this room or most people in this room would agree with that. And so all of these studies, my own included, treat the decline in trust in science or the potential decline as a problem to be addressed. And often it is a problem to be addressed. If people distrust medicine and therefore refuse to get vaccinated, they not only put themselves at risk, but they put the rest of us at risk as well. And that's a bad thing. But, moreover, in recent decades, mistrust has been deliberately fomented by parties with a vested interest in undermining trust in science. And as Steve wrote about many years ago in Science as a Contact Sport, and I wrote about also many years ago, now emerging to down, one of the major culprits in that space is the fossil fuel industry. The key thing that both Steve and I have talked about is that these attacks were never based on genuine problems in science. And by genuine problems, I mean unreliable models, or sample sizes that are too small, or studies that can't be replicated. Those problems exist, but the attacks on climate science were never about that. They were always politically and economically motivated, and that's also bad. So much of my work has been in defense of the integrity of climate and other environmental science in the face of these politically, ideologically, or economically motivated attacks. I think I can just skip that. But tonight I want to do something a little different. I want to talk about some problems within contemporary science, problems that may be legitimate sources of worry about our science, problems that make it harder for someone like me to defend science, and that I think need to be addressed because we do need to make sure that the science we do has a high level of integrity. So I want to begin tonight with the story of a single fraudulent scientific paper and the work it took to expose that paper and get it retracted. Then I want to consider whether this is an isolated example or part of a larger problem in science, and talk a little bit then and open it up to discussion about what those of us who are part of the scientific enterprise or who care about the scientific enterprise might feel about it. So this is the paper. It was published in the year 2000 and authored by three scientists, Williams, Crowe, and Munro. The paper presented itself as a comprehensive, independent, objective review of the safety of the herbicide glyphosate, which many of you may know of as Roundup, the world's most widely used herbicide. The paper was retracted this past December, so just a few months ago, and when it was retracted, the editors explained why. They had concern about the authorship, which had been misrepresented because Williams, Crowe, and Munro did not actually like this paper. The paper was conceptualized and written by Monsanto employees, Monsanto being the manufacturer of Roundup and the world's major manufacturer of glyphosate. Because of the concerns about the fraudulent authorship, the current editor of the journal dug deeper and expressed concerns about the validity of the research findings in the context of the misrepresentation of the contributions by the authors and the study sponsor, and of course potential conflicts of interest associated with that fraud. The editor, who's Martin Van Bellen, concluded that these conflicts of interest had led to bias evaluating studies reviewed in which the authors discounted studies that showed evidence of harm, but foregrounded studies that did not. So an asymmetrical treatment of positive and negative findings. Of particular importance, the editor explained, was the historical context and influence. The paper has significant impact. This is the editor quoting from the editor here. The paper had a significant impact on regulatory decision making regarding glyphosate and Roundup for decades. Given its status as a cornerstone in the assessment of glyphosate safety, it is imperative that the integrity of this review article and its conclusions are not compromised. The concerns specified here necessitate this retraction to preserve the integrity of the journal. So how did the editor know this? How did the editor learn this historical context? Well, we did that. My postdoc, Sasha Gordon, the original paper stated, quote, reviews on the safety of glyphosate and Roundup herbicide that have been conducted by several regulatory agencies and scientific institutions worldwide have concluded that there is no indication of any human health concern. And by the way, I want to just point that out because I feel like that should have been a red flag right from the get-go. Just think about all the things that possibly, maybe, probably, the weight of evidence, the balance of evidence. I mean, climate scientists, we're always putting caveats in all of our work, and this is like no indication of any human health concern at all. But that got through peer review. But as I said, because of ongoing questions, the editor said, the author said, oh, sorry, this is the author speaking about it. Because of the ongoing questions, the authors have undertaken a new review to, quote, produce a comprehensive safety evaluation and risk assessment for humans. And the conclusion of the paper, quote, under present and expected conditions of use, Roundup herbicide does not pose a human health risk to humans. But in 2017, it was revealed that this paper was not comprehensive, it was not objective, and it was not written by the authors, William Rose and Munro. As I've already said, it had treated irrelevant evidence selectively, and it was not actually written by its authors. It was written by Monsanto employees. In other words, it was ghostwritten. How do we know that? Well, all of this came out in a lawsuit involving the allegation of harm, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, from glyphosate use. Jobs was produced in recognition of the paper was conceptualized and largely written by Monsanto employees. And they did this in response to a large body of scientific studies that did show evidence of potential harm to humans, particularly carcinogenicity. So this paper was deliberately written to try to counter scientific studies that did show evidence of harm. How do we know this? Again, a set of emails from 2015 revealed this. So the paper was originally written in 2000. 15 years later, the International Agency for Research on Cancer did undertake a systematic review of glyphosate, and they did it in a context with quite strict rules about conflict of interest, so no one who worked for Monsanto or any other major pesticide manufacturer could serve on this panel. And this panel concluded that glyphosate was probably carcinogenic. So in response to this, Monsanto decided to write a set of papers that would challenge the IARC conclusion. And it's in these emails that we learn the truth about the 2000 papers. So the Monsanto executive who led this was called William Haynes, and he proposed that Monsanto should counter the IARC finding with a scientific review of their own. In fact, they would actually do an entire special issue of the journal Critical Reviews in Toxicology. So every single paper in this special issue was written by people who either worked for or were paid by Monsanto. The first author would be an academic, and he named 3 possible ones, and I'll get back to them in a minute. And they would handle it in the same way they had handled an earlier paper, and that earlier paper was Williams, Crowe, and Munro. Discussing the conclusion of the IARC that glyphosate was probably carcinogenic, Haynes proposed that they counter that with a paper of their own, in which they would, quote, bring down the cost by us, that is to say Monsanto, doing the writing, and they, the authors, would just edit and sign their names, so to speak. Recall that is how we handled Williams, Crowe, and Munro. So in short, Williams, Crowe, and Munro was the successful model that they would then use to counter the IARC work. Now, when this information came out, it was widely discussed in the mass media. None of this was a secret. Like so many things I've worked on, most of this was kind of hidden in plain sight. There was extensive media coverage, these are just 3 examples, NPR, CNN, and Fox News. And interestingly, there's not much difference in the coverage from Fox News to CNN. They all report that the evidence of the lawsuit showed that this paper was ghostwritten. And even Robert F. Kennedy, who now defends glyphosate, was actually counsel for litigants in this case, said, quote, Monsanto for 40 years has been following the tobacco playbook, ghostwriting science, buying science. So the evidence seemed pretty clear that Monsanto had deliberately manipulated the scientific literature, seeding it with biased papers in order to claim that glyphosate was safe, when in fact there were, and they knew there were, serious questions about its safety. So we wanted to know, well, how impactful was this paper? Did Monsanto achieve what it hoped to achieve for this paper? And why had it not been retracted, given that we now knew that it was in fact ghostwritten? And also given that ghostwriting is acknowledged as a form of scientific misconduct, including by the journal that published the paper. And then a bigger question is, how widespread are these practices? So how impactful was this paper? Well, we traced its influence through 3 domains. Academic literature, so how often was it cited in academic papers? Policy documents, how often was it relied on or cited or invoked by regulators? And Wikipedia, because that's the main place that the public go when they have a question about something. And also because, as many of you may know, if you ask ChatGPT, is glyphosate safe, the main source the large language models will go to is Wikipedia. So what we found, first of all, was that the impact in the academic literature was huge. So this is a plot of cumulative citations over time. And I should say this work was done by my research associate, postdoc, and now research associate, Sasha Korov. We found 1,300 citations in Google Scholar. It is in the top 1.1% of all publications ever mentioning the word glyphosate. Out of 500 papers for which we obtained the full text, only a handful had any caveats about whether this paper was problematic in any way. And the really depressing part, no drop-off in citations after 2017, even after it's revealed that this paper is ghostwritten. We also looked at policy documents. These are a little bit harder to find on the internet because they're not amalgamated the way scientific articles are. But we found 36 policy documents that cited this paper. 29 of them took the paper at face value and used it to support the safety of glyphosate. And these included reports from the EPA, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Environmental Ecosystem Services, the World Health Organization, Health New Zealand, the Canadian government, and several lawsuits, including a major lawsuit at the International Court of Justice. And then this is just one example from like a public thing that I really love. This is frequently asked questions about herbicides in Canadian forestry. I've read on the internet that glyphosate causes cancer and is an endocrine disruptor. Is that true? No. Independent scientific review panels conclude that glyphosate is non-carcinogenic. Such reviews conducted by highly qualified professional toxicologists and risk assessment specialists provide the most credible and reliable sources of information. So you see why this is so damaging, right? You can't just say, oh, this is a crane. This is, Bobby Kennedy with a worm is there. These are highly qualified professional toxicologists, and they've told us that glyphosate is safe. And then we looked at Wikipedia, and as I said, super important as the main place many people go for information, key source of AI training data models. So what did Wikipedia have to say about glyphosate safety? Well, this turned out to be quite interesting. We found 4 articles, and this is only English, we haven't looked at other languages. 4 articles discussing glyphosate or Roundup, all 4 cite Williams et al., and mostly uncritically. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because Wikipedia is actually paying more attention than scientists, apparently, because before 2017, it's uncritically cited as an authoritative safety review. After 2017, we see an interesting thing. We studied the editing history of these sites. There were multiple attempts by Wikipedia editors to remove this paper or to contextualize it by saying, hey, this paper is problematic. And in every single case, those efforts were thwarted by other editors on the grounds that the paper had never been retracted. And if it hadn't been retracted, then it wouldn't be objective not to use it. And since then, we actually gave a version of this talk at a Wikipedia conference to try to persuade the editors, well, okay, well, it's now been retracted, but in any event. So the main argument that people made in Wikipedia was that removal of the paper would be unwarranted unless secondary reviews had criticized its methodology or findings. They contended that court documents and internal emails, which could be cherry-picked, do not necessarily undermine the scientific validity of the study unless it was retracted. So we sent a letter to the editor asking for the paper to be retracted. But before I get there, I think so what we concluded was this paper had exactly the impact that Monsanto wanted. It became viewed as an authoritative paper in the scientific literature, heavily relied on by regulators and government agencies, and influencing the public perception of this chemical as safe through Wikipedia. In fact, Monsanto employees boasted about what they had achieved, that this would be considered the reference on Roundup and glyphosate safety. There's a later email on the second round where some of them say, we should really get t-shirts for the work we did. Okay. So this is an email from the time. I'm going to skip. This is where she says this will undoubtedly be regarded as the reference on Roundup and glyphosate safety, so that came true. And then I'm just going to bring your attention to this here, which we'll get back to in a moment. So then she thanks all the different people at Monsanto and also a consulting firm called Cantox that maybe some of you have come across. I noticed there's Ian Munro, so he's a consultant with a private consulting firm. And then she says, but there's going to be even more. In addition, the environmental and ecotox publication on Roundup and glyphosate will be published this summer, Ecotoxicological Risks, so now going past cancer, and this will be written, the first author will be a man named John P. Giese, and that paper was already in press. So we'll come back to Mr. Giese, I should say Professor Giese, whatever it is. Okay, so now, since 2000, there's been a large body of new scientific data that show all kinds of potential harms from glyphosate. So not just cancer, but many diseases, including, many possible diseases, including Parkinson's and possibly autoimmune diseases, disruptions to the gut microbiome. And these data come from epidemiology, they come from animal studies, and they come from in vitro studies. So we have a wide range of methodologically complementary work. They also involve evidence of a mechanism. Some of you who know anything about epidemiology know there's always this issue in epidemiology. You can prove an association, but if you don't have the mechanism, maybe it's just a coincidence, maybe it's just correlation, not causation. But scientists have now demonstrated the mechanism, which is oxidative stress. And there's now a large and growing body of work that shows other likely harms, genotoxicity, effects on gene expression, effects on brain, lung, liver, and kidney function, endocrine disruption for sure, and chronic inflammation, which itself is associated with all kinds of diseases, and effects on the gut microbiome, which have a wide range of possible effects, including autoimmune diseases and brain signaling. It might be that Bobby Kennedy actually was exposed to too much glyphosate. Now, in part in response to this big body of scientific evidence, in 2022, the Ninth Circuit of the U.S. Federal Court overturned the EPA's interim registration of glyphosate on the grounds that the EPA had failed to follow its own guidelines regarding cancer risk and failed to consider impacts on endangered species. And if you're at all interested in this subject, the decision is incredibly scathing, and it's also incredibly well-informed scientifically. So if you ever feel depressed that like judges and politicians don't understand science, read the Ninth Circuit decision, because these guys did such a good job. And you can find it on the internet pretty easily. Just this past year, the prestigious Ramazzini Institute in Italy issued a formal request to both the EPA and the European Food Safety Agency to reconsider based on the current weight of scientific evidence. And as you may know, we've had numerous court cases now in the United States where courts have found 4 plaintiffs suffering from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Still, the official position of the US EPA and the European Food Safety Agency authority is that glyphosate is safe to use. So we see the way in this story, the way science has been corrupted. A corporation deliberately seeded the literature with a misleading paper. That paper hung around in the literature for 25 years before someone, a historian of science and a geologist, decided to say, hey, could we please, and I should say also an astrophysicist. Sasha is an astrophysicist by training, who's making himself as a computational social scientist. So this is a bad story, and we know it has had impact, and we're still now, the EPA has still, the official position of the EPA is still that glyphosate is safe, even though we have very substantial bodies of evidence that say otherwise. But it does raise this bigger question about how widespread these practices are. And we've only really started to scratch the surface of this question, but I thought it would be fun tonight to just talk a little bit about where we're taking this work. So you remember I showed you this email a few minutes ago where they talk about how they hope that Williams et al. Will become the definitive reference on glyphosate safety, and they say that there'll be a follow-up paper published by John Giese and some colleagues on the ecotoxicology assessment of Roundup. So who is John Giese? Well, John Giese is a Canadian scientist, a quite famous, prestigious, respected scientist, a professional, who is credited as one of the inventors of PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals. You may know that the state of Minnesota recently sued the 3M Corporation for the costs of cleanup related to PFAS in the environment in Minnesota. In this court case, Giese admitted under oath to taking at least $2 million from the 3M Corporation for his help in defending PFAS chemicals and defending the safety of PFAS. And this included while he was the editor or on the editorial board of several major journals where articles about PFAS were being published. These included Environmental Science and Toxicology, The Science of the Total Environment, and Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. I'm betting there's more than a few people in this room who are published in those journals. I know I have. So this leads to a few questions. It leads to a lot of questions. First of all, is ghostwriting sufficient cause for retraction? And we say emphatically yes. And it's great that Mark Vanderberg dug in deeper and found problems with the science, but sometimes the biases in these things can be very subtle and maybe not easy to find. So it's important to make the point that ghostwriting alone should be grounds for retraction, and in fact is, according to Elsevier. Elsevier journals are supposed to follow the so-called COPE guidelines, which say a retraction might be warranted if there is clear evidence of any form of misrepresentation, including fictitious authorship, that may compromise the reliability of the findings. And they further say journals should address integrity concerns regardless of article age. So you should never just say, oh, it's an old article, it doesn't matter. And our results affirm that because we see how this paper is still being cited today, 25, now 26 years later. But if we ask the question, well, were the scientists involved sanctioned for this scientific misconduct? The answer is no. Both Williams and Giese were investigated by their universities, but neither one was sanctioned. Williams' behavior was reviewed in 2017 by the New York Medical College, who concluded that there was, quote, no evidence that he had violated school policies. Giese was also investigated by the University of Saskatchewan, who told the Canadian Broadcasting Company that there are, quote, no apparent grounds for review of his conduct. Now, it's not, these reports and reviews have not been made public. My guess is that they concluded that no rules were violated because most universities have no rules on the subject. Most universities have no governance structure for dealing with these issues in any kind of systematic way. But ghostwriting is a form of fraud. It misrepresents who the authors are, and it does so deliberately to make the papers seem more objective than they are, or to hide conflicts of interest. And evidence, so far as we know, we definitely need to do more work on this, but it suggests that sanctions against scientists for participating in ghostwriting schemes are rare. Now, is it common? How much should we be worried about this? Well, it's hard to analyze for the obvious reason that people don't admit to it. People, of course, try to hide this. So you're trying to find something that's deliberately hidden. But there is evidence to suggest that ghostwriting and financial conflicts of interest, as well as practices such as letting funders vet results before publication, are not rare, at least in some areas of science. Yet retractions are rare, even when evidence of serious conflict of interest is available, and even in some cases fraud. So we asked ourselves the question, okay, we know where these other guys involved in this, and has anybody looked into this? And fortunately, just last year and a half ago now, a paper was published on this issue of Monsanto ghostwriting. So the author, A. Matheson, looked into this and found at least 14 papers with strong evidence of inappropriate influence, so either ghostwriting or corporate funding that wasn't disclosed. And only one of these papers, Williams, Monroe, and Crow, was retracted. And so here's the one that's been retracted, that's our paper. We've now submitted 2 more requests for retractions of papers that we now know for sure from the Monsanto papers were ghostwritten. But there's 3 more that were part of that 2015 Reviews in Critical Toxicology, none of which have been retracted, even though the evidence, as I've said, of this undue and inappropriate influence has been around now for quite a few years. The University of Chicago Law School, Jason Bateman, has just recently published a preprint about a 2015 article by Ream et al. And it turns out this article is super important because it was also ghostwritten, and it misrepresented a key study that demonstrated tumor development in mice that had been exposed to glyphosate and showed a clear dose-response relationship. So this paper, the one that showed the tumors, was potentially a real thorn in the side of Monsanto, potentially something that should have made the EPA look again. And it's been widely cited in court cases in defense of glyphosate. But what Jason shows in this paper is that it was wrongly dismissed by Green, who alleged that the mice had developed the tumors because they'd been exposed to a virus, but there was no evidence whatsoever that had happened. He just made that up. And yet, even though it's completely made up, this paper has been generally accepted by judges who were not in a position to realize the paper was ghostwritten. And it remains in the literature and is still being cited. Now, it's hard to know for sure, but the available evidence suggests that these are not isolated examples. In the 2000s, British psychiatrist David Healy testified in the British Parliament that in his estimate, as many as half of all papers dealing with drug and medical device efficacy were ghostwritten. Most of this evidence, again, comes from lawsuits and often from biomedicine, from drug development or device development. When the drugs go wrong and people get hurt, they sue, and so then we find out information. So in the late 1990s, the company Park Davis undertook a publication campaign designed to encourage the use of gabapentin beyond the scope of its official license. Gabapentin is an anti-anxiety drug that is used for other things as well. They planned 24 papers, 11 appeared in the target medical journals, and none, not one, disclosed Park Davis's role in writing the papers. Only 2 mentioned financial support in any way. You may remember from 2007, Merck promoted the painkiller Vioxx despite evidence that it was causing fatal heart attacks. The FDA later estimated that probably more than 50,000 people died from heart attacks caused by Vioxx. A paper published in the Annals of Internal Medicine omitted some participants' deaths. So people died and they took those data out of the study. The paper's author later confessed that Merck had designed the trial, paid for the trial, and ran the trial, but asked him after the fact to be its author. So in other words, just to sign off on it. And in 2009, Wyeth published 26 papers in medical journals on hormone replacement therapy, while it was earning nearly $2 billion a year from that therapy. And as you can imagine, those papers all say that hormone replacement therapy is effective and safe. So what we see here is not just ghost writing, but what the Canadian sociologist has called ghost management. Planning papers, planning whole bodies of scientific literature designed to support the interests of the corporation and in doing so to hide or discount evidence of potential harm. So if we ask the question, why was the Williams et al. Paper not retracted sooner? And we asked the editor that, he said, before you guys, no one ever asked. So this whole area of problem falls through the cracks because no one thinks it's their job to do this. I mean, there's a whole set of questions about exactly why that is, and why did toxicologists not pursue this, but they didn't. So my argument tonight is that we have enough evidence to say that there is at least potentially a large problem. It's not just that this one or a handful of fraudulent papers have slipped through peer review, although obviously that's bad. But I think that what we see in this story is that the scientific community has just not taken this problem very seriously, or no one sees it as their role to do this kind of, what in effect is a kind of policing. And I should just, by the way, say, we only did this work because I got funding for Sasha to help me do work on climate change, work related to climate litigation. And while we were waiting for documents to come, we actually found ourselves with a bit of time on our hands. So I said to Sasha, hey, there's this thing I've wondered about for a lot of years. What do you think about looking into this? So in a way, it was completely accidental that we even did this. I'm going to skip over that. Okay, yeah, I think we can skip that. And as I've already suggested, universities have not taken the issue very seriously either. As you saw, Williams and DC were investigated, but they faced no consequences. We have some other similar examples. In fact, this seems to be the norm. And if anyone here knows of a case where someone was sanctioned for ghostwriting or scientific misconduct, I don't mean sexual harassment, that's a whole different story, I'd be interested to hear. So this question about what universities do or don't do leads me to the other thing I want to talk about tonight. And in some ways it may seem unrelated, but I think it's related to this question of scientific integrity and the question about whether we are minding our own store. Are we keeping our house clean? And are we doing the work we need to do to sustain public trust, which is what I started this talk with, to make sure that we sustain scientific integrity so that we have the right to expect public trust. And that leads me to what I promised in the title of the talk we will spend a few minutes on tonight, which is Jeffrey Epstein. It's of course well established, it's been all over the newspapers in recent weeks, that Epstein gave many millions of dollars to prominent American scientists and universities, including a gift of more than $9 million to my own institution, Harvard. But he gave a lot of money to Stanford too. Now, interestingly, you're not getting off the hook. I know I teach at the Stanford of the West, a beast, but Now, Harvard stopped taking Epstein money after 2008, and there's an interesting story there. But many universities continued to accept his gifts even after he was a convicted sex offender. There have been multiple newspaper articles on this issue, so we know a fair amount about it. Many focusing on prominent, really famous scientists connected to Epstein at leading universities like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Columbia, NYU, Arizona. So why does this matter? Does it matter? And how does this connect to the Monsanto problem? Well, I've been chewing over my mind about this because obviously people think this is bad. All the newspaper articles about these scientists indicate that the people writing the articles think there's something to see here. So what is it exactly that makes these relationships problematic? Well, there's a few possible reasons we could consider. The obvious one would be criminal behavior. Obviously, it would be a problem if leading scientists, including the former president of Harvard, were involved in human trafficking or other criminal activity. But so far as I know, there's no evidence of that. Yet still these associations seem problematic. And they've led some prominent scientists to resign their positions wholly or in part. So why? Why exactly has this happened? Well, again, there are several possible reasons to be concerned, and I think they all relate to scientific integrity and trust in science. So one concern could be bypassing peer review. Epstein funded projects that he A convicted sex offender with no scientific training, in fact, no college degree, found appealing. There's no call for proposals, there's no peer review. And so this raises concerns that he was funding bad science, science that perhaps shouldn't have been funded, and that might not have succeeded in a competitive peer review process just because it appealed to him. I kind of think that's true to some extent, but I think it's also hard to make a strong case that the men he funded were bad scientists. And I'm using the word men deliberately because they were almost all men. At Harvard, there were no women, or for that matter, people of color. These were all white men who were being funded. And that, you could argue there's a concern there as well. But the thing is, whatever work they did was eventually going to be published in peer-reviewed journals, so it would be vetted. So I think it's a little bit difficult to say that, there's a high likelihood that this was really bad science. I think the bigger concern is not bad science per se, but creating an unlevel playing field. A playing field that disadvantaged other scientists and other approaches and other topics, and that inappropriately affected the whole scientific research landscape. And maybe that's where women and minorities come true. So now, we've worked so hard, we, women, people of color, to earn a place in the scientific community, to compete successfully, to gain grants. And now this guy comes along with millions of dollars that we don't even have a chance to compete for. So that's an ethical problem. But also, I think he skewed the subject matter. And there is some evidence of this. And those of you who've read my book, Science and the Mission, know I've spent a lot of time thinking about the question of how funding can set the research agenda in ways that may be sometimes concerning. So if you look at the projects that Epstein funded at Harvard, many of them involved varieties of genetic determinism, and some arguably had a kind of neo-eugenic flavor. So one example was Martin Novak's program in evolutionary dynamics. And some of you here know my husband, and when I was first looking at this, I turned to Ken and I said, has no one noticed that the abbreviation for this program was HEAD? Okay, so the PED program focused on genetic and evolutionary origins of behavior. Okay, so on the surface, that's fine. No doubt behavior does have a genetic and evolutionary component. But we also know that behavior has social, psychological, and economic components. But Epstein didn't fund the latter, and no one who might have wanted to work on those things had the opportunity to compete for those fundings. So I think in this regard, we can say that he did distort the scientific landscape at Harvard. He created an unfair epistemic advantage for scholars who pursued studies that advanced genetic explanations, as opposed to, for example, deeper understandings of the social determinants of behavior. And so his funding choices reinforce certain epistemic biases. In this regard, part of the larger concern about, in this respect, I think we can place this as part of a larger concern about how the scientific research agenda, like the political agenda in Washington, may be unduly set by powerful donors, both individuals and corporations. So that matters. That's something I think we all should be thinking about. But it also matters, I want to argue, to how the public views science. So if we go back to our trust in science study and our data, and here I have a better graphic, so that's good. One of the questions we asked people was, how strongly do you believe that scientists should prioritize these goals and that scientists actually tackles them? And we had 4 goals that we looked at. I forgot where that came from. I think it may have come from the Pew Research Funds. I guess it's time to party. Stanford's such a fun place. Anyway, so we asked about 4 goals: public health, energy, poverty, defense, military technology. And in every case, we see a pretty big gap between what the public thinks the priority should be versus what they think science is prioritizing. So the public consistently thinks that scientists should be more focused on public health, solving energy problems, and reducing poverty. And they think that science should be less focused on defense and military technology. Now, this is important because this may be a source of distrust. because it suggests that people think that the values of the scientific community are off. And we know there's a large body of social science research that shows that values mismatch can be a source of distrust. And in fact, we know that a lot of how people vote, sometimes people will say, why are people voting against their own self-interest, right, for that, right? But many people will vote for the candidate who they think shares their values, and that trumps particular individual policy concerns. So if people think that the values of the scientific community don't match their own values, this can be a source of distrust. What can also be a source of distrust is simply the idea that people don't have good judgment. So according to Science Magazine, there was a recent piece a few weeks ago on this, if you read through the Epstein files, you find that it's not just a handful of scientists. It's not just Martin Novak and Larry H. Summers. Hundreds of scientists are named in these files, including many considered to be scientific leaders. So it's not just a handful of creeps. Now you could be thinking, if the scientists didn't do anything illegal, or if they only took money for research, especially if they didn't know or didn't realize that Epstein was a convinced, well, he probably was a convinced sex offender, but he was also a convicted sex offender, then they didn't do anything wrong. And you might even be thinking quietly to yourself, well, I mean, if Epstein had come to my lab and offered me $2 million, no strings attached, no grant proposal, I might have taken it. But here's the problem. What do these associations say about the judgment of the people who associated with Epstein? If they knew he was a convicted sex offender. So especially, I think from an ethical standpoint, we could make a distinction between before and after he was convicted. But even then, if they didn't know, what does it say about their judgment? That they didn't bother to do due diligence about a guy who was inviting them to go to fancy parties, to fly on his private jet, and maybe attend parties with underage women? Judgment matters. It matters in life in general, and it especially matters in science. And let me just go back for here. In fact, a whole lot of research in history, philosophy, sociology, of science in recent years, including some of my own work, including my book, Trusted Science, is all about how, no matter how hard we try to be objective or fair, or to have decent sample sizes in our studies, at the end of the day, we can never eliminate judgment from science, because we make judgments about the methods we choose, we make judgments about what questions are important to ask, and we make judgments when we're evaluating our data. And this is one reason why two qualified professionals can look at the same data and not necessarily agree on its interpretation. The Epstein files, like the Monsanto ghostwriting and the 3M payments to journal editors, in some cases document explicit corruption. But in all cases, they document serious failures of judgment. And several of the scientists involved in this story have admitted that. So why should the American people trust science if some of our leading practitioners exhibit such poor judgment? And in fact, should they trust Harvard and Stanford, MIT, and other institutions that accepted money from Epstein and thereby helped a convicted criminal to launder his reputation? Should they trust the work that we do? And I was thinking about this a lot in terms of the pandemic, because during the pandemic, the School of Public Health at Harvard was issuing statements practically daily about what we were learning about the disease, about masking, about vaccine safety. And in a sense, when the school issued those statements, they were asking the public to trust them and to think that they were the appropriate experts with good judgment who could give the American people good advice about how to respond in this situation. Now, it may seem unfair to judge science in general by these scientists. It may seem like guilt by association, but the fact is that we are all judged by the company we keep. And it goes deeper because, as I've just said, judgment is an essential part of science. Indeed, a large part of what I argued in Why Trust Science, and what nearly all historians, philosophers, and sociologists of science would say we've come to understand about science, is that it always involves judgment. No matter what methods we use, what statistics, whether we pre-register our studies or not, or whether as an author, an editor, or peer reviewer, we are always making judgments. I mean, just think about when you review a paper, right? You're judging whether you think that paper is adequate. whether the arguments hold up. You're judging the quality of the methods and the quantity and quality of data. And you're arguing whether the arguments and evidence are convincing, whether we have enough evidence to say that something is proven, is fundamentally a question of judgment. This was the argument that Michael Oppenheimer and colleagues made in our book, Discerning Experts. We said there that fundamentally science is a process of discernment. And I want to shout out my medieval history colleague, Nancy Cassiolo. She wrote a book called Discerning Spirits, which was about this incredibly interesting book about medieval assessments to try to figure out if a person was possessed by the devil or inspired by God. And it's super interesting because they had these panels of experts who tried to decide which was, and the part of it was about whether you could discern the spirits. So we borrowed the title from her. So we argued in this book that if you look at scientific assessments, fundamentally they're processes of discernment and evaluating the evidence and making judgments about whether that evidence is sufficient, and if it's not, about what additional science needs to be done. So it all depends on the intellectual judgment of those experts. More than personal judgment are not the same as intellectual judgment, to be sure. But if you knew or suspected that someone had bad moral judgment, would you trust them when they assured you that vaccines did not cause autism or that climate change was making wildfires worse? I think there's a good chance you wouldn't. What evidence do I have to support that argument? Well, we do have clear evidence that Americans do have concerns about scientific integrity. So this comes from the Pew Research Organization. And this was specifically about medical research, but I think it's probably applies to science in generally. So people were asked how much confidence they had in scientists to do a good job, care about people's best interests, provide fair and accurate information, are transparent about conflicts of interest. Oh, and something got messed up here, but the last one was are held accountable when they commit misconduct. And what we see here, this got moved, this is the conflict of interest. What we see here that a substantial number of Americans don't think that scientists are transparent about conflicts of interest. I agree with that. But more than half of us don't think that scientists take responsibility and are sanctioned for scientific misconduct. In other words, American people don't think that we are protecting the integrity of our own operation. Conversely, more than half of Americans surveyed said that open data, independent oversight increased their sense of trust in science. So my conclusion is, and this is something that I've started writing about, I wrote about this in Science Magazine a few months ago, if we want to sustain and where necessary rebuild trust in science, we need to ensure that our science is in fact trustworthy. And I think that means we need better rules about dubious conduct, better rules about data transparency and conflict of interest, and we need real penalties for researchers who engage in scientific misconduct, such as ghostwriting. And I think we have evidence that that would, in fact, make a difference. Thank you very much.
We're going to be doing a moderated Q&A session. And so I hope to start off with some students to begin first. But I have like a question prepared for you, Dr. Oreskes.
Okay.
And mine was going to be about accountability regarding everything. Considering that universities don't have any systems in place and things like that, where do you think scientific accountability will begin, and how do we start that process?
Well, I wouldn't say that universities have no systems in place. I mean, I think it's a real patchwork quilt. I think some schools do, some schools don't. But I think what we've certainly seen at Harvard is highly ambiguous. Like, it's not clear. Martin Novak was sanctioned, although some of you may have noticed he was put on administrative leave where he was not allowed to teach for a year while he was paid full time. And I'm thinking, that sounds like a sabbatical. So, it tells you something about the institution that the punishment is you don't get to teach, or I don't know. So, I think we're very inconsistent about it, I guess would be my argument. And so I think all universities should start to develop, or maybe not even universities, maybe this would be something for the National Academy of Sciences to take up to say, okay, what would it look like to have a set of fair, transparent rules and procedures so that it's clear what's allowed and what's not, and it's also clear what would be an appropriate sanction. So it's not just left to the subjective judgment of individual administrators. I think that would go a long way. I think it would help faculty, because I think there are faculty who do honestly feel a little bit confused about what's allowed and what's not. And I think it would help the administrators, because then they'd have a set of clear guidelines to go by. And I think it would help public trust if the public saw that we took these issues seriously, and that when people committed misconduct, that they were meaningfully sanctioned and not just given a sabbatical.
Beautiful, thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much. I was struck by what you said about the journal, upon request for redaction, saying, "Oh, no one asked us before." Right? I imagine there's a lot of papers like that. I imagine there's a lot of papers like that. And I wonder, I've seen increased paper tracking based on image implication recently, based on a lot of the work of like Elizabeth and people like that. So I wonder if there's any organization or what you think might work as an avenue for reporting things like ghostwriting that actually take action. And there's a lot of papers where people know, but it's not being requested for attention.
Right. Well, again, I think that's where, let's prove we have it, that's good coming and right. So it's not great that it just gets left to someone like that Elizabeth, because then you feel like, well, who's she? And who made her the god of image replication, right? And the data colada people have been criticized as being somewhat subjective, or they're sort of self-appointed guardians, and that's not great. So that's why I do think, some more systematic system where it's clear, what the guidelines are and who is responsible for them. So one thing you can imagine, just as universities have IRBs for reviewing ethics of research proposals, you can imagine an IRB equivalent. The universities have to have a committee. It could be made of, tenured professors who understand the research process. So if someone thinks there's a problem, they could submit a complaint to them, and then they could review it. I think something like that. And again, where the guidelines are clear so that it's fair, because obviously some people might be unfairly accused, or some things that might be accidents or honest mistakes, could be accused of fraud. People who have been accused of fraud, like there's the Chestnut Gino case at Harvard right now, she claims it was all just mistakes. I don't think anyone thinks that's credible at Harvard, including it wasn't, because there were just way too many of them, right? But you do need to take into account the possibility that there could be honest mistakes and not necessarily assume that every error is fraud.
I'm curious if there's some amount of discourse in science comes from people who understand the process of science, also seeing very clear moments of please stand up.
Thank you.
So there's within the intelligence their own we very clearly know that there's times when we speak incorrectly, and then we can correct it accurately. A moment where we go to fake science and redistribute the narrative. But then there's also some amount of science that's just complex, and the audience is not trouble understanding. And then if they read your papers that have different views, then there's no understanding of the public of what's around. Sorry, in the language.
Yeah,
so I'm just worried about, are we over-indexing on self-releasing, which I think is really important and great that we're doing it. But if you had, say, you were given $100 million, you could suddenly allocate a bunch of money to hiring a bunch of people to either, go and police science, or to communicate science to the audience in like the scientific method, so that the general public can understand this. Like, would you improve the education system, or would you spend that money on policing science, where we're improving the niche information for the people who really care about it, but it doesn't stick up.
Well, I don't like the word policing, because obviously that's a word that for a lot of people sounds punitive and it implies punishment, So I wouldn't like to think of it so much in terms of policing. I'd rather think about it in sort of maintaining scientific integrity. And so, you could think of an IRB board as a kind of policing, and in a way it is, but you can also think of it as just a check to make sure that people aren't engaging in unethical experimental practices, because we know that when we didn't have IRBs, those things did happen. And I guess I don't know if we know that they never happen anymore, but I mean, I guess the assumption is they happen less frequently because people will say, no, you can't do that. So I guess I see it as something like that. And I think the dollar cost of that would probably be pretty minor. I mean, I know my university, you don't get paid if you serve on IRB. It's just one of the things you do is service the university, like, you know, being on the library committee or faculty council or research committee. So it just doesn't seem like it would be that expensive to do. But I think the value in terms of being able to show observers that we take these issues seriously and that we do something about it. Because for me, like, what's really terrible, you know, I think about this Geesey guy, right? So he's editing Science of the Total Environment while he's taking money from 3M. I mean, that's just completely unacceptable. Yet the University of Saskatchewan says he doesn't do anything wrong. I mean, something's wrong with that picture, right? And so that's what I'm thinking about. I'd like to see every university have some kind of mechanism in place to say, no, that's not okay, and he's got to give that money to the library or resign or come clean or do something. And, you know, Geesey only admitted these things because he was subpoenaed and under oath. And we shouldn't have to wait for a lawsuit for these things to be dealt with.
You pointed at the issue of court judgment by scientists, but I see more of a judgment issue that starts with the universities themselves. And we see, for example, with fundings that university gladly accepted over decades from countries like Qatar, and to fund their Middle East departments, and to a great extent, and influence public understanding of the Middle East and the West. And so I view this as the university setting up the examples to the scientists. Where we need money, then just get it anywhere from whoever gives it to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's more of a statement than a question, but I absolutely agree. And I think, you know, it's related, and again, a similar thing. Universities need to have policies about how we judge whether we should be taking money that could unduly influence the research agenda, the research topics, and most universities don't, because, you know, they take the view, if you've read Science and Mission, it begins with this joke that someone did, in fact, tell me when I was an assistant professor, there's no such thing as tainted money, only taint enough, right? And most universities have that view, right? You know, all money is good. Derek Bach, who I greatly admire in many ways, but I completely disagree with about this issue, he once made a statement. He said, yeah, we should take money from any source, no matter how bad its origins, because then we take it and do good things with it. So it's almost admitting it's a kind of money laundering, right? It's definitely reputation laundering. And in some cases, we know that people are doing these things deliberately to influence the research agenda, or as you said, to influence public opinion. There's a big literature on this. There's a big literature that I've contributed to on the influence of oil and gas money. And we also know we have a lot of information on this from the tobacco history. The tobacco industry gave money to every single major university, medical school, and cancer research center in this country. And I found an astonishing document once where a tobacco executive is boasting about this. He says there were only 3 universities that turned down our money. Now, it didn't say which 3 it was, which is really a bummer. I was like, oh, but I'm going to guess BYU, Baylor, and I don't know, maybe Southern Methodist University or something. Like, we know that some Christian-affiliated colleges have rejected tobacco money because they have principles. You know? So, you know, I do think you're absolutely right. And so this, in a way, this is almost the tip of the iceberg. This giant question about who we take money from, how we take it, how we deal with conflict of interest, or I should say, don't deal with conflict of interest. And I think that, you know, one thing that's super interesting about the public, whoever they are, but, you know, in opinion polls, people may not know exactly what's going on, but they kind of pick up on things, right? And I think part of the reason there's so much interest in the scientists and the Epstein story is because it's terrible, right? And there's also a kind of schadenfreude that these elite guys who are flying all over the world, it's a kind of come down. But also it has these questions about, well, what is Harvard anyway? And what is Stanford and Columbia and all these schools? What are they really doing here? At Harvard, there's been obviously a lot of discussion on Larry Summers. But to my mind, and those emails reveal, they're kind of shocking in the juvenile quality of the conversation. But to me, the worst thing is that Larry Summers was responsible many years ago for defrauding the federal government and kind of destroying Russia. I'm speaking very broadly here about a very big, complicated issue. But during the transition, I don't know, does anybody here know this story? During the transition, when communism ended in Russia, the US government funded a multi-million-dollar project at Harvard. So this is like 1990, 91, 92, to a group of economists led by Larry Summers to figure out how to guide the transition into capitalism in Russia. And the idea was, how do you set up a banking system? How do you set up a stock market? How do you set up shareholders? A stock exchange, all these institutions that Russia didn't have, or the Soviet Union didn't have. So it was a really, really important problem. And the idea was that these smart economists at Harvard would figure it out. Well, not only did they not figure out, but the leading economist involved in it turned out he was soliciting money from friends and families to invest in a fund, like the first, hedge fund, whatever it be. So there's a massive conflict of interest, and they never actually did the work they were supposed to do. And as we all know, the transition did not go well. So the federal government sued Harvard for fraud, for breach of contract, and Harvard paid a $26 million fine to cover what these guys had done. And Larry Summers was the man who had hired these people, had supervised them, and he, went on to become president of the university. One of the key economists is still a professor in that department. They were never sanctioned at all for this work, even though they cost the university $26 million and cost the people of Russia probably a whole lot more than that. So, when all this stuff came out about Epstein, I was reading this thinking, okay, this is bad, but I actually think the Russian thing is way worse, and no one at Harvard talks about it. No one. Only I had heard some rumors of this years ago, and then when Summers finally had his downfall this week, there were a couple of people, these last few weeks, there were a few people I thought who were here when that happened, who might know, and they might talk about it now. And sure enough, I had dinners with a few people, and people spilled the beans on this. And if you dig enough on the internet, you can actually find stuff on this. But, how is that okay, right? How is that okay?
Okay, we have time for one more question, but it's gonna have to be very short due to having 5 minutes left.
Okay, and I'll try to keep my answer short.
I saw someone in the back that was pointing me, so.
Great, thank you for talking. I wanted to say that your Merchants of Doubt documentary that was based on the one really effective being inspired was excellent. So thank you.
You're welcome.
My question was, what do you think are the main verticals in which business trends and science are going to be the most prevalent coming up in the future? One thought I have is AI and the effects of AI and social media on kids. So what do you think, and what other verticals should we be looking at?
You mean going forward?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. I feel like we're in such a maelstrom right now, and so many different things happening. Once it's so hard to predict where any of this stuff lands. But I do think the whole landscape of vaccine safety is going to continue to be contested for quite a few years to come. And I think there's been a lot of damage there that it's going to take time to repair. So that would be a big one. And then I do think the whole pesticide thing, the very fact that the Trump administration is bending over backwards to strip people of their legal rights to sue for redress when there's potential damage. I think it shows how worried they are, right? Because, Bayer is looking at billions of dollars of potential liability over Bayer bought Monsanto, so all this stuff. And if you read their company reports, they have to disclose this as a corporate risk. So And it's not just glyphosate, you know, I mean, I've been talking a lot in the last few months with scientists who are studying this, and I spoke to one leading scientist who said to me, yeah, the really terrible thing about all this is I don't even think glyphosate is the worst of these chemicals, but it is a chemical that huge, huge numbers of Americans are exposed to. And so, but I think there's a giant story to be told about toxicity in the environment, chemicals, and the interactions between chemicals that are not well understood at all. And I think when people begin to learn about that, you know, it could go two ways. It could be that they're outraged and angry and they demand that Congress pass stricter laws and they demand EPA does its job, which it's not, in fact, doing right now. Or they could get disillusioned and think that scientists have betrayed them because there's a component of this that involves that.
Thank you so much. With that, let's give one more round of applause for Dr. Lee.